The decision by the Chinese government and its president, Xi Jinping, to force students to complete their degrees face-to-face, not online, could send as many as 40,000 young Chinese people scurrying back to Australian universities. Now, while the move is welcomed by the Education Centre, remember it was once our third biggest export earner, there is alarm in the property markets about where so many people will find accommodation so quickly. Today, Ingrid Willinge spoke to Torie Brown, the Executive Director of Student Accommodation Council, which is part of the Property Council of Australia, and started by asking about the tightness in the rental market.
I mean, it's overwhelmingly positive news for the purpose-built student accommodation sector that was disproportionately impacted during COVID. So we're really excited about the return of Chinese students to Australia. What it means for my members is that they're going to see students coming back into their assets, often booking beds before they arrive in Australia. In particular, we expect to see lots of students going back into the Melbourne market, which still has plenty of capacity for beds in the purpose-built student accommodation sector. Where we expect to see more pressure is in some of those smaller markets where the supply of student accommodation beds is less. And those markets include Brisbane, which is already very popular with international students, Perth and Adelaide.
So, I mean, the question here is, because you're talking occupancy there, you've touched on it that some states are doing better than others, but when you look at these purpose-built student beds, this is even before the Chinese government announcement, we were looking at potentially 0 for vacancy rates in some states this year. So, you know, where do those students go? What happens there?
Yeah, so we already expected there to be really good returns into the Brisbane market. We've been seeing that occupancy across the Brisbane assets are sitting at about 98%, and that's before we've seen all of the extra international students come back. So we expect that some students will have to go into the rental market. They'll be trying to find rental accommodation, and that does become really tricky in markets like Brisbane where we know there's really low private rental, and you do see students who are having to compete with mums and dads and key workers in the rental market. What we do know is that international students, particularly students from China, really understand and like purpose-built student accommodation because it's safe, it's a custom learning environment for them, and they understand that they're going to be looked after in a culturally appropriate way. So we would expect to see lots of the Chinese students trying to find beds in purpose-built student accommodation. At the moment, 1/4 of all students across beds Australia-wide are Chinese, and the next biggest cohort is actually domestic Australian students who make up 26% of students in purpose-built student accommodation beds.
Yeah, I'm interested in that demographic actually. Is that, you know, I was surprised to see such a big proportion as domestic Australian students. Is that something that's been growing since the rental market has become quite a bit tighter?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So we saw the amount of domestic students really increase last year, and we think that that's because of 2 things. One is that the rental markets are getting tighter, so being able to find, you know, a studio apartment in a student accommodation bed somewhere in Brisbane has been easy and appropriate, but we've also found that the understanding of what student accommodation is and what it offers has grown amongst domestic Australian students, whereas it wasn't that well understood probably pre-COVID.
For Chinese students that potentially don't want to go out and compete in the rental market, in the general rental market, if they can't get a bed in some of these areas where there is full occupancy, does this put a handbrake then on the education sector from what you know with the demographics?
So we really hope that that doesn't happen. We've seen overseas, particularly in Amsterdam, the situation where universities have had to say to students, don't come to study here until you've found somewhere to live. We're not at that point yet, but we really want governments to plan about how they grow the supply of student accommodation, so we're not looking down the barrel in 2 years of a situation where we don't have enough beds for all of the students that want to study in our world-class education system. So we really want to see all levels of government prioritising the development of new student accommodation. International education is our #1 export as a country, our #1 services export. So we really want to see governments at the state, federal and local government level working with the industry to identify appropriate sites, to increase development, to expedite planning approvals, which can take years, and to try and get more developments out of the ground faster. At the moment, the development pipeline is very focused on Sydney and Melbourne, but we do need to see growth in the other markets because those are also really important markets for international students.
So in terms of the supply pipeline going forward, you've got some supply coming online in Sydney and Melbourne, but the rest of the states, is there anything sort of touted for approval there?
It's really muted in the other states. And, land supply is a big issue. We need to see strategic use of land. If you've got a great parcel of land that's near an education institution or on really good transport links, we do think that governments should be labelling that land as an education precinct and trying to prioritise student accommodation so that we can see growth in the areas there needs to be growth. And it is a matter of working with government as well about the disincentives to investment that exist. So foreign investor taxes, for example, are hugely expensive for people who develop and own student accommodation, particularly in jurisdictions like Queensland, where we know there's a real need. So we need to start lowering those taxes to increase the amount of investment flowing into the market so we can start seeing those new developments come online in the places where we know it's really needed, because it does take a couple of years to get approval and deliver a new building. And if we want to grow our share of international students as a country, we need to start working on that now.
Interesting stuff, Torie. Really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us here on the program.
Thanks for having me.